Hey guys, so today we're just going to go through the balance of payments and then some key terms as well. So just first of all, starting off, the balance of trade is just basically the visible exports minus the visible imports, and the balance of invisible trade is the opposite, the invisible exports minus invisible imports. So what we're really going to focus on today is we're going to look at the balance of payments account. And the balance of payments account is just the total exports minus the total imports. So that's visible and invisible. It can be in surplus, which means our exports are greater than imports. It can be in deficit, which means our imports are greater than exports, or it can be balanced, which is quite rare, where exports are equal to imports. So Ireland at the minute will be in a balance of payments surplus. Our exports tend to be greater than our imports. So when we look at governments and their accounts, we have the current account and the capital account. So we know that the current account tends to be things like public sector wages, like teachers' wages, doctors' wages, nurses' wages, whereas the capital account tends to look after things like the once-off payments or once-off income. So it could be something like the sale of Aer Lingus, or it could be the building the new children's hospital. Okay, so when we look at the balance of payments on the current account, it's the visible exports minus the visible imports plus their invisible exports minus the visible imports. And that balance then can be positive or negative. If it's positive, it means that we have a surplus, and if it's negative, it is a deficit. Balance of payments on the capital account then. So what we do is we record our receipts and payments of capital items. We know the capital, we said this before, is once off in nature. And when we look at an example of receipts, it could be foreign investors purchasing Irish property or buying shares in Irish companies. And when we look at some payments, it could be Irish people buying property abroad and shares in foreign companies. So remember, with receipts, even if it's foreign investors purchasing Irish property, the money's coming into Ireland. Whereas if we are buying property abroad, money's going out. Just a little side note here, we talked about the capital account before and when it's okay if the to have a deficit. Well, it's okay if we have a balance of payments deficit on the capital account if it's a case whereby we have purchased, let's say for example the Lewis tram line would have been something that was purchased from abroad. So that's a once-off payment, it's a once-off import, and it's going to improve our economy because people will be able to travel much better. Okay, so we've often talked about exports and how an increase in exports is good for the economy. So we're going to just look at the good and bad things about an increase in exports. So first of all, what often happens is because there's an increase in exports, there's more income in Ireland. So Irish workers have more disposable income, which often means then that we see a rise in imports because they're now able to afford luxury goods. And they might be goods that are just not produced in Ireland, such as runners, like your Nike runners, or even high value goods. So you might buy a brand new car, and of course we know that Ireland don't produce cars. You see an increase in demand for capital goods, so to meet the increased production demand, more machines may be needed. Increased revenue for the government, so this is a positive thing. So PAYE, PRSI, VAT, corporation tax, so that's increased revenue for the government, so they can spend that how they see fit. And then finally, we might also see a fall in the government expenditure because you have less job seekers benefit being required. If we have an increase in Irish exports, there's going to be more jobs available. So first one, not so good. Second one can be positive or negative. If more machines replace people, then that's going to be an issue. So if we see a decrease in labour and increase in capital. And then I suppose when we look at increased revenue is a good thing for the government, and also a decrease in government expenditure. Okay, so when we look at Ireland, multinationals are huge in Ireland. They contribute so much to our economy in terms of jobs, in terms of corporation tax, and a number of other aspects that we're just going to go through. So how does that impact the balance of payments current account? Well, first of all, we can see they pay corporation tax. That's money coming into Ireland or staying in Ireland as such because it's a foreign company. We see that they create jobs for Irish citizens. We have skills learned by Irish workers, so we have a greater skilled workforce, and that in turn attracts more foreign direct investment. So the companies that are here train up our workforce which then can attract more foreign direct investments. For example, if you're working for Apple and they train you in a particular area, and maybe the Samsung is a company that would think about going to Ireland, they see that there's loads of workers there already that are trained up in the types of skills that they would also need, so they may decide to locate in Ireland. This reduces government expenditure on training and education, so it's good if the company themselves are willing to put through the workers through training. And then you see things like internships and sponsorships. Some MNCs pay for college education, or they may decide to sponsor certain events. Negative things is if we see repatriated profits, so you can kind of see sometimes these mirror one another. So if they repatriate profits, or they have a high level of repatriated profits, then that's money that Ireland could have benefited from in the form of corporation tax. Competition with Irish firms, which may lead to closure. So maybe in Ireland we have small, medium enterprises that may not be able to compete with large scale multinational corporations. Bring workers from their own country, so depending on the visa, they may be entitled to some public services, healthcare and education. So what does it mean when we have a balance of payments deficit? It means that there's too much money leaving the country essentially. And to make up for it, the government will either have to raise taxes or they'll have to borrow from abroad. And the Irish people could lose their jobs if that's the case. And as I mentioned earlier, when a deficit's not a cause for concern. So first of all, if it follows a few years of a surplus, then it's not something that's kind of becoming a trend. It may be just a once-off. If there is a deficit on the current account but a surplus on the capital account, so let's say for example in a particular year the government had to allocate more money to education, and that might be just it's like in the age group that are going into education, there's just a higher amount in that particular year. Well, then that may cause a deficit on the current account, but we still have a surplus in the capital account because there hasn't been major one-off payments. If there's a large amount of raw materials imported to produce Irish finished goods, so for example, you might see a case whereby we might import clothing, and then the clothing comes to Ireland, and in Ireland they print something on the front of it and then they sell it and it's an Irish finished good. And then finally, a large spending on the capital account, if that's what's causing the deficit, that's okay. As I mentioned earlier, could be something like purchasing the Lewis tramline. But it's always important that we try to reduce any balance of payments deficit, or at least always try to keep it in surplus. So a couple of ways we can do that, and you'll always hear me talk about this: buy Irish, import substitution. So giving money to companies who may set up to produce goods here in Ireland that we previously would have imported. But also on you guys, you should try and buy Irish as well. It's really, really important to support our local and our national economy. Import restriction, so quotas, tariffs and excise duties on certain goods that are imported into the country. Deflationary government policy, so deflationary, remember we talked about inflation and we have deflation as well. So deflationary just basically means to make sure that the prices of goods and services don't increase. So we see an increase in taxes, decreased government spending so that people have less money to spend. It's the idea that if people have less money to spend, you'll see them being unable to afford luxuries or less luxuries, and then as a result we see less imports. And then finally, government agencies such as Fáilte Ireland and On Board BIA promoting Irish exports, but also promoting Irish produce abroad. Okay, so I'm just going to really fly through this because we've talked about this when we looked at the EU before. So with free trade, we know that we have free trade among the member states of the EU, now currently 27 member states. We also have other trade deals. For example, we have a trade deal the EU has a trade deal with Iceland, so we have free movement of goods to Iceland as well, and people. So countries can buy and sell without any trade barriers or restrictions, example, custom duties being imposed. And we are used to that. If we buy anything from the EU, we don't pay any custom duties. A customs union exists where the member countries agree to remove all trade barriers between them and impose a common external tariff on imports from non-member countries. So the EU is a customs union. When we look at things like tariffs and quota, embargoes or subsidies. These are all elements of protectionism. So countries just try to stop foreign imports, and the reason they do this is to help their own businesses export. They do this by using trade barriers, and these are examples of trade barriers. Okay, so let's look at reasons for protectionism. So, to protect Irish jobs, to protect Irish firms, so imposing tariffs and embargoes or quotas just so that we can try to promote exports and promote Irish produce. Political reasons, example the USA and Cuba, so there used to be an embargo on Cuban goods to the USA because of their ties with the former Soviet Union. To prevent dumping, so we would have seen dumping within Europe back when the Common Agricultural Policy was extremely popular. But you have some countries that can produce these goods very, very cheaply and then dump them into other markets, and the agricultural sector in that market may not be able to compete. And then to reduce the balance of payments deficit, and finally to allow new industry growth. So just to quickly run through some of the trade barriers, you have a tariff, which is just a tax on imports. A quota, so that's restricting the quantity imported. So we see quotas quite a bit when we look at fishing. More so to protect our waters and the amount of fish stock in our waters. So we know that there are quotas on the amount of fish that foreign vessels can catch in our waters. Exchange controls, so restricting the amount of trade with certain currencies. Embargoes, so complete ban on imported goods, and my example there was between USA and Cuba. Administration barriers, so obstacles in the path of importers, so like a lot of paperwork which can often deter people from importing. And then subsidies, so aim to increase exports in a country. So subsidies aren't as such a trade barrier, but most definitely it is a form of protectionism where you subsidise a particular industry or companies in a particular industry in Ireland so that they can reduce the price of their goods, and then that makes it more attractive for other countries to import our goods to their country. So the importance of international trade, we know this already because we've talked about it so much when we look at Ireland being a small open economy. It gives us a greater choice of goods, and also it gives us the option of commodities that are not produced here. So for example, I'm just looking here at my Nike runners. So we don't produce things like that in Ireland. And without trade, we wouldn't have those goods. More competitive prices. So that's, if we import things like clothing, if we produce our own clothes, well then maybe it would cost an awful lot of money because we can't grow the cotton here, or we can't have certain raw materials here. So it leads to more competitive prices. Innovation then as well, so when we see something that we had previously imported, maybe it's a case whereby companies here then decide to make a similar product, or it kind of encourages entrepreneurship as well. And new ideas. I mean, if you think about Apple and Samsung, we would have never produced those goods ourselves. So like that's us availing of innovation of American corporations. Provides employment both domestically and internationally, and it enhances international relations. So we talked about customs union earlier, and then we have something that's called a trading bloc. So a trading bloc is a group of countries sharing free trade agreements with each other. So we see the EU is one that we're obviously part of, and it's a big one. 27 member countries, as well as free trade agreements with Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway and Switzerland. We also have certain free trade agreements with Canada on physical goods. So not services, but physical goods, things that you can hold in your hand. North American free trade agreements, so that's between the US, Canada and Mexico. And the newest one that recently the EU brokered a deal with on agricultural products is Mercosur. So that's South American trading bloc of Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay and Paraguay. So again, something that we've looked at before when we look at exchange rates in the EMU, the Economic and Monetary Union. So we joined the EMU in 1999. And we changed from the Irish pound to the euro currency. So if you remember the three things that the ECB aim to look after, so they control the interest rates, they control the money supply, and they also control the availability of credit. And the idea of all of this is this idea of price stability across member states. So advantages we would have seen from becoming part of the single currency, single monetary union. The elimination of currency conversion costs, so we don't have to change currency every time we change to a different, or we go to a different country, or even if we purchase goods from a different country in the EU, we don't have to change money. Price transparency, so if I buy something from another member state, I can see clearly how much, or you can see if I'm making any sort of saving than buying it in Ireland. And then also the fact that it's a strong reputable currency, and that's because of the strict measures that the ECB implement with regards to our currency. A couple of disadvantages. One would be that, and we've talked about this before, decisions of ECB sometimes favour large members and don't work in Ireland's favour because we are a small and open economy. And then finally, this is a good thing and also a bad thing because, first of all, we've said before, the last option in an economic downturn is to devalue your currency. You should never consider it as the first option. But if we really drastically needed to do so, we don't have the option of doing that. So because we're part of the EU. So we can't devalue our currency in times of economic downturn, which is a disadvantage, but sometimes also an advantage as well, particularly if you look at other member states that may not have strong economic policy. They may feel that the best thing to do is to devalue the currency, and we would have seen that with some of the South American states, which we know it puts a lot of suffering on the people because you devalue the currency. It takes a long time for prices to fall in line with that devaluation. So a couple of things that would affect the exchange rate. Well, first of all, we see foreign trade. So if there's a high level of trade in euro, it'll cause a rise in demand for euro. And the greater demand, the greater the value of the euro currency. So remember that the more euro that people want, and maybe outside countries want, so that they can trade in for euro goods, well then that's going to increase the value of the currency itself. So high interest rates will attract savings from other countries, which will strengthen its value. We often call that hot money. Okay. Level of the money supply, so that will have to increase. In terms of how it affects the exchange rate, if the level of the money supply is very high, our exchange rate, our currency won't be very strong against other currencies. If it is very low, then it will be very strong against other currencies because, again, it means it's scarce in supply. Also, then we see the central bank will also intervene in the exchange rate. So if the value of the euro becomes weak, the ECB can buy euro from foreign reserves to strengthen it again. So buying euro from foreign reserves, you basically buy up the euro currency and make it rare again, so that when something is scarce in supply, then that will obviously inflate the price of it. And then finally, speculators. So when we look at speculators are people who buy up currency if they feel the price of that currency is going to inflate. So we talked about this before. We talked about speculators in terms of the housing market. So if people think that the housing market, house prices are going to increase dramatically, they may start buying houses now, which we know means that pushes up the prices of houses further. Or sometimes speculators can have the opposite effect. So if they think that the prices of houses are going to fall, they can withhold from buying those houses until they do fall. Now, the most kind of impact that they will have is when they drive up the prices of something. So in terms of currencies, if they feel that, like we see a lot now with gold, because when gold constantly appreciates in value, so you have a lot of speculators buying up gold, and that further pushes up the price. Okay, so let's look at the term purchasing power parity. So I know this sounds like an absolute mouthful, but I can promise you it makes sense when you look at the example itself. So just quickly through the definition. In a free market, the exchange rate between one currency and another currency is in equilibrium when their domestic purchasing powers at their rate of exchange are the same. So if we take, for example, a can of Coke in Ireland may cost €1, but euro to dollar exchange rate might be €1 is to $1.06. PPP would mean then that a can of Coke in the USA should be €1.06. But we know that a can of Coke in the USA may be much cheaper because we import Coca-Cola and the USA actually produce Coca-Cola. So you have to remember that when Coca-Cola comes over here, it may be a case whereby included in the price of a can of Coke might be transportation costs. So that's not something that we consider here. So we would expect maybe in the USA that it's much, much cheaper to purchase a can of Coke. So PPE means that the prices will stay the same. So that if the euro in Ireland and the exchange rate is $1.06, well then a can of Coke in the USA is $1.06. Another term to look at, and this can happen, foreign exchange markets would often try to eliminate this possibility. But people who are very good at this can actually keep an eye on the different currencies and make profit from it. So this is what we call arbitrage operations, and it occurs when equilibrium or when exchange rates are not in equilibrium. If this happened, people could exchange sums of money across currencies and make a profit. So just giving you a couple of exchange rates here. So €1 equals $2, £1 equals $1.50, and €1 equals £1.50. So very straight, we could change $10,000 or euro, and we could get $20,000 from this exchange rate here, or £15,000 from this exchange rate here. However, I could also change €10,000 to £15,000 using this exchange rate. And then I could exchange the £15,000 into dollars, which would give me 22,500. Okay, if you want to know how to do that, all you have to do, you just take the 15,000 and multiply it by the 1.50 exchange rate, and you get this 22,500. And then when we go to change that back into euro, so all I do here then is divide both sides by this exchange rate here, 2, okay? I get 11,250. So I actually make a profit because I started out with 10,000, but now I have 11,250. And finally, just to talk about devaluation. So devaluation is decreasing the value of a currency relative to that of other currencies. Now, sometimes students get really confused by this, so just pay attention when I'm going through the example. So if the EU decided to devalue our currency in terms of a dollar, so for example, let's say currently if somebody from the US wanted to buy euro, they get 0.95 euro for their $1. If we're going to devalue, then what happens is they actually get more money for their dollar. So they get €2 for their $1. So when we talk about decreasing the value, you might think, well, miss, that actually increased. But it didn't in terms of our goods. And so if we look at that in terms of a product, if I wanted to buy something that was $1 in the US, well, previously it only cost me 0.95. Now it's actually going to cost me €2 to buy that good. Whereas for their currency, they now get more euro for their $1. So that's a fall in the value of our currency. So we talked about devaluation earlier, and we said that it's a good thing. It's good in a way that we can't do it because we're part of the EU, but it can be a negative thing as well that we can't in times of economic downturn, severe economic downturn. It's not something that you would jump to do straight away. So first of all, if we devalue the currency, non-euro imports become more expensive, and Irish people would need more money to buy imports. That's a good thing because it decreases the value of imports. However, if the goods are not luxury items, for example, if we look at the price of oil, I mean, most people's cars run on petrol or diesel, or their homes may run on oil, and that will then decrease, or that will become more expensive for us to buy, and that's an essential good. Exports to non-euro countries become cheaper, so they'll be able to buy more of our exports because of the devaluation of our currency. You'll see inflation. So inflation will actually increase because the imported raw materials become more expensive, costs increase, and therefore prices overall would have to increase. And that's one of the things. Often we think that devaluation will lead to a decrease in inflation because of the decrease in imports. But it really depends on whether inflation impact or the costs increasing is higher are greater than the impact of the fall of imports. So obviously if imports fall greatly and costs increase but don't increase that much, well then it has had a positive impact. Whereas if costs have increased and as a result prices increase and the inflation element is much stronger than the fall of imports, then it has had a negative impact. Finally, it can lead to a boost to trade and employment if it's a case whereby more Irish goods would be demanded abroad because they're cheaper, and then people here substitute and start to purchase more Irish goods.